"You trapped my son," she said at Thanksgiving, her voice as polished as the heirloom silverware in her hand. I didn't flinch. I didn't defend myself. I simply reached into my bag, pulled out the thick envelope I'd kept hidden for 5 years, and placed it quietly beside my plate of untouched cranberry sauce. That moment, frozen like the autumn air outside the window, was not the result of a sudden outburst or impulse. It was the final stop on a long, carefully measured descent into truth. My name is Joey King. I'm 32 years old, a pediatric internist at Long Ridge Medical in Boston, and until that night, I thought I could endure anything for the sake of family. I grew up in Vermont, the daughter of a florist and a substitute teacher. We didn't have much, but we had decency, quiet honesty, and the kind of steady love that makes a girl believe in the idea of building a life with someone. So when I met Miles Harrington during medical rotations, I didn't see his last name first. I saw his laugh, his ridiculous fondness for mint tea, and the way he stayed late helping terrified new interns adjust. I saw a man who could listen and who didn't need to win every room. That was before I met his mother. Miles's family was Boston legacy generational donors to hospitals, board members at medical schools, the kind of people who used surnames instead of first names and considered silence a form of discipline. Iris Harrington, his mother, had once been chief of surgery at that very hospital and walked its halls like she still owned every scalpel. The first time I was invited to their Beacon Hill townhouse, I spent an hour choosing which earrings to wear, only to be told, over white asparagus and sea bass, that my shoes weren't quite built for this floor. Miles laughed it off. "She's just protective," he said later that night. When I cried in the car, "You'll win her over. Just give her time." So I did. For years. We dated quietly through residency, married after our fellowships, and signed a prenup his mother insisted on. Miles had been hesitant to ask, but Iris made it clear every Harrington spouse signed it. It was presented over dinner like a formality, just tradition, nothing personal. I signed it without blinking. I didn't marry for money. I had my own savings, my own student loans, and more importantly, my own spine. But somewhere deep inside me, a quiet voice whispered, "You just became a guest in your own marriage." And I ignored it. The first year of marriage was manageable. We were busy with work, too tired to notice the small slights. But by year 2, things began to shift. Miles started missing our dinners to attend family meetings I wasn't invited to. Iris would drop by our apartment with leftovers that somehow included new sheets and a list of recommended OBGYNs. My friends called it microaggression. I called it noise. But it was steady, like a tap, 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 trying to chip away at something. The worst part wasn't Iris. It was the way Miles never quite stepped in, not fully. He made excuses. "She doesn't mean it. She's just old school. She only wants the best for me." I tried harder. I brought gifts, sent holiday cards, volunteered at Harrington Foundation events. I baked bread. I offered to host brunches. Every gesture was met with the same brittle smile and quiet, elegant rejection. I became fluent in being tolerated. I still remember the day the shift became permanent. It wasn't a fight or a blow-up. It was a Tuesday. I came home early from clinic, exhausted, and found Iris in our kitchen. She was wearing my apron and making soup. Miles hadn't told me she was coming. He stood there sheepishly, stirring like a boy caught cheating on a test. "She was just helping," he said. Iris didn't even look at me. She just said, "I was worried Joey might be too tired to nourish you properly." That night, I stared at the ceiling for hours, listening to Miles sleep beside me, wondering when exactly I became an outsider in my own house. It wasn't sudden, it was erosion, and it continued subtle, constant, and precise. By year 4, the pressure to have children became relentless. Iris gifted me books on fertility, left magazine clippings on my nightstand, and once called me at work to ask if I'd considered freezing my eggs since pediatricians rarely prioritize family. I started to shrink, slowly. Then, one evening, I opened Miles's laptop to find an email. Subject line, just in case, it was from a divorce attorney. Dated 2 weeks prior. The sender wasn't Miles, it was Iris. And beneath it, Miles's reply, not yet, but I'll think about it. I closed the laptop. My hands were steady. My chest was not. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't cry. I simply opened the drawer, took out the prenup, and read it again. And then, for the first time in 5 years, I slept through the night. Thanksgiving came. Iris invited me personally this year, which should have been the first red flag. I dressed carefully. I wore her favorite color. I brought her favorite wine. I arrived alone, gave my coat to the housekeeper, and took my seat at the long dining table. When she raised her glass and said those words, "You trapped my son," I was ready. What I did next wasn't impulsive. It was inevitable. Miles hadn't always been this passive. In the early years, he'd make coffee before I was even out of bed, scribble notes on napkins, like a teenager in love, and plan surprise dinners when our schedules miraculously aligned. He was never loud or showy about his affection, but there was a steadiness to him that I mistook for strength. I thought he'd be the kind of partner who grew braver with time. What I didn't realize back then was that Miles didn't grow braver. He grew quieter, especially when it came to his mother. Iris Harrington was a master of elegance and control. She didn't raise her voice or storm out of rooms. Her power came from precision, from the way she chose her words like a scalpel, from the way she'd compliment me with a smile that never reached her eyes. Every interaction was like a chess match I never agreed to play, and somehow I was always the one who ended up cornered. I tried to take it in stride. After all, I'd grown up around women who spoke plainly and expected to be met halfway. I didn't understand the language of quiet disdain until I met Iris, and by the time I learned it, I was already married. There were no explosive fights, no screaming matches or ultimatums. Instead, there were things like seating charts that left me at the far end of long family tables, or accidental double bookings that meant I was left out of brunches with Miles's siblings. There were gifts for Miles on our anniversary that included his childhood photo albums, labeled carefully with notes like, "Before it all changed." There were whispered comments from family friends at fundraisers, saying things like, "So you're the pediatrician," with that faint surprise that made it clear they'd expected someone else. And always, there was Miles, standing slightly behind Iris, never correcting, never pushing back, always just absorbing. By the 3rd year of marriage, I began to feel like a side character in my own story. The apartment we once decorated together slowly began to reflect more of Iris's taste than mine. The chairs she had delivered as a gift replaced the ones I picked from my favorite local shop. The dishes, the linens, even the artwork started to echo her sense of order and legacy. I wasn't being erased loudly. I was being overwritten, page by page, with a steady hand. And yet I kept showing up. I kept trying. I kept thinking that if I just achieved more, worked harder, smiled longer, I'd be seen not as a threat or a placeholder, but as a partner. So I buried myself in work. I took on more complex cases. I won awards I barely had time to acknowledge. I brought in funding for the pediatric trauma unit, built a research track for medical students, and led a citywide vaccination initiative. On paper, I was thriving. At home, I was quietly unraveling. Miles started coming home later. At first, he said it was surgeries running long, then meetings, then calls from his father's foundation. I didn't question it. I was tired. And maybe part of me didn't want to know what would happen if I pulled on the loose threads too hard. Until one night, I found him asleep on the couch, phone unlocked in his lap, screen still open to a message. It wasn't flirtatious. It wasn't even cruel. It was just distant. From Iris. She's still not the right one. Miles, you know that. It's not too late to make the right decision. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't cry. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stared out the window. That was when I realized how long I'd been holding my breath in this marriage, waiting for permission to belong, and it never came, because it was never going to. The next day, I called Lauren, my friend since undergrad, now a family law attorney. I didn't tell her everything. I just asked if she still had a copy of the standard Harrington prenuptial template. She emailed it within 10 minutes. It was worse than I remembered. Not only did I waive all claims to family wealth and assets, but any joint purchases using Miles's trust fund, including our condo, defaulted to him in the event of divorce. There was even a morality clause tucked into the final section, clearly written by someone who thought the real danger in a marriage came from the woman marrying in. I sat at my desk, staring at that clause, my ears ringing. All this time, I'd been walking on glass, and now I had the documentation to prove it. I wasn't protected. I was managed, like a risk, like an investment that hadn't yielded the expected return. Still, I didn't leave. I couldn't not yet. I needed time to think, to feel, to gather myself, time to plan. Because if Iris Harrington wanted to play legacy games, I would not give her the satisfaction of leaving quietly. 2 weeks after I reviewed the prenup, I started noticing things I hadn't seen before, not because they weren't there, but because I'd been too focused on surviving. Small patterns began to reveal a larger design. The dinner invitations I never received, the weekend retreats that Miles always claimed were just for the board, the women Iris kept around, always just at the periphery, always so polished, so eager. And one name kept coming up, Harper Whitman, a surgical resident who'd transferred to Boston General the previous fall. Ivy League pedigree, family in pharmaceuticals, single, childless, and according to hospital gossip, handpicked by Iris to shadow the best minds in medicine, Miles included. I didn't ask him about Harper directly. I didn't accuse him of anything. Instead, I observed. I watched how he softened when talking about her clinical efficiency, how his tone warmed when describing her patient notes. I didn't feel jealous. I felt insulted, not because she was younger or more polished or closer to Iris's ideal, but because she was being positioned as my replacement, and neither of them had the decency to admit it. That's when the shift happened in me. I stopped asking for answers. I started documenting patterns. During this time, I reached out to Dr. Alan Kim, one of the senior pediatric surgeons I'd worked with on a recent pro bono initiative. He'd always been fair, measured, someone who saw people for their work, not their last name. I told him part of the story, not everything, just enough. I asked if he'd ever heard of Harper shadowing Miles. He paused before answering, then leaned back in his chair and asked, "You want the professional version or the honest one?" I told him the honest one. "Your mother-in-law has been quietly building a circle around Miles. He doesn't seem to notice, but the board does, and people talk. I'd suggest watching your back." Joey. That night, I went home, opened a private email I hadn't used in years, and started backing up every digital record I could find. Emails, schedules, notes from family meetings, even those carefully curated holiday cards where I'd always been placed just out of frame. Then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I called my mother. We hadn't spoken often since I got married. Part of me had been embarrassed, ashamed even of how I'd let myself become so small in someone else's world. But she didn't judge. She listened. And when I told her about the prenup, about the meetings, about the emails, she went quiet for a long moment before saying, "Sweetheart, they built a cage and convinced you it was a house." That sentence stayed with me. It rang in my ears at the hospital, in the car, in the quiet spaces between meetings. A cage, beautiful, tasteful, expensive, but still a cage. And once I accepted that, I couldn't unsee the bars. Every conversation with Miles felt rehearsed. Every visit from Iris felt strategic. Even the apologies began to sound like part of a PR script. That's when I decided to start therapy again. Quietly. Just once a week at first. My therapist didn't tell me to leave. She asked a different question. What would staying cost you in 5 years? I couldn't answer right away. But the question lodged itself under my skin. I started sleeping in the guest room. Miles didn't question it. He said he respected my need for space, then promptly started spending more evenings at the hospital. I began testing small boundaries. I skipped one of Iris's charity galas. I declined a brunch with the Harrington wives. I stopped wearing the necklace Miles had given me on our wedding day, the one Iris had chosen. No one said anything directly, but I noticed the shift in tone, the silence, the way people looked at me longer than necessary, as if waiting for me to explain myself. Then came the email, not from Iris, from Harper, short, polite, and clearly designed to look innocent. She wanted to connect outside the hospital, maybe get coffee, said she admired the way I balanced work and life. The message was timed for Saturday afternoon, exactly when I knew Miles would be at the gym and Iris would be hosting one of her family teas. I replied with a simple line, "Thanks for reaching out. Perhaps another time." I didn't send it from my hospital address. I sent it from the private email Iris didn't know existed. The final confirmation came 3 days later. A forwarded message from one of the administrative assistants in the hospital's ethics committee, someone I barely knew, but who must have sent something. Attached was an internal memo drafted by Iris herself, advocating for a mentorship pipeline to pair promising female residents with senior male specialists for strategic clinical alignment. Harper was the first listed. Miles's name was right there in the supervising column. My name was nowhere, not even a mention. I printed the memo, folded it, slid it into the same envelope as the prenup. Then I called Lauren. "I need you to look at something for me," I said, "and I need to know what happens if I walk away with nothing except my name." Lauren didn't ask why. She just told me to come by her office after hours and bring everything I had. When I arrived, she already had a legal pad waiting and 2 glasses of wine poured. I handed her the envelope, and we sat in silence as she read through the prenup first, then the internal memo, and finally a few of the printed emails I'd backed up. After a long pause, she looked up and said, "They never thought you'd be the one to hold the pen in the final scene." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Maybe because deep down I had stopped seeing myself as the author of anything. For so long, I'd been reacting, surviving, explaining. I forgot I still had the option to choose how the story ended. I didn't want to destroy Miles. I didn't want revenge. I wanted truth, visible and intact. And more than that, I wanted to reclaim my voice before it disappeared entirely beneath the weight of someone else's narrative. We spent hours reviewing the clauses, including the ones that waived asset claims, the ones that assigned blame subtly through language like incompatibility or legacy misalignment. Lauren confirmed what I already knew. If I left, I would walk with nothing but my name and whatever savings I had earned on my own. And still, I nodded. "Good," I said. "That means when I leave, no one can say I took anything that wasn't mine." The next 2 weeks, I focused on moving quietly. I began moving some of my personal belongings into storage using a friend's name on the rental form. I backed up every work document, cleared my devices of shared accounts, changed passwords, and started a private health consultation. I wasn't planning to disappear. I just wanted to be able to move without asking permission. Miles barely noticed the difference. He was consumed with a hospital fundraiser, one that Iris had designed as a showcase for the new mentorship program. I saw the invite card on our kitchen table, and I didn't ask for a +1. I already knew I wouldn't be attending. The following Sunday, Iris called unexpectedly. Her tone was overly warm, almost syrupy. She asked if I would be available for Thanksgiving this year. I said yes, without hesitation. She didn't need to know what I was planning. And besides, I needed her to believe I was still playing her game. What she didn't know was that I'd already requested emergency leave from the hospital and had made arrangements with my landlord to break the lease. My bags weren't packed yet, but the timeline was set. I wasn't going to run. I was going to show up on my terms and leave with clarity. In therapy, I began processing not just the betrayal, but the way I had trained myself to stay. I'd excused Miles's silences, justified his compromises, and translated his cowardice into kindness. I told myself his passivity wasn't a choice, that he simply didn't know how to navigate his mother's hold on him. But that wasn't true. He knew. He just didn't want to choose, because choosing would mean disrupting the safety net Iris had built, the carefully orchestrated life she maintained through proximity and power. And I realized I wasn't married to a man. I was married to a system, to an idea passed down through blood and decorum, one that had no room for someone like me unless I agreed to shrink. The week before Thanksgiving, I found a small jewelry box in the back of the closet. It was wrapped in silver paper with a note taped on top, written in Iris's handwriting. For Harper, you've brought such light into our family. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I placed it back where I found it and didn't say a word. The next morning, Miles left for rounds as usual, kissed my cheek absently, and told me we'd talk about Christmas plans after the holidays. I nodded, poured myself coffee, and printed the final copy of the prenup. That afternoon, I drove to the South End and met with a real estate agent. She showed me a 1-bedroom unit near the hospital with warm brick walls and large windows facing east. I signed the paperwork with no hesitation. I didn't cry. I didn't stall. I wanted a space where no one else had ever hung their mother's curtains or suggested I should dial down the color palette, a space where I could take up every corner if I wanted. That evening, I boxed up the few sentimental things I still cared about and made a separate folder with the documents I planned to bring to dinner. It included the prenup, the mentorship memo, and a handwritten letter I'd addressed to myself months ago. The night I found the email from Iris titled, "Not Yet." Thanksgiving arrived cold and crisp, with frost glazing the car windshields and sunlight bouncing off the windows like glass. I dressed with care, choosing a deep navy dress and a coat I'd bought years ago on impulse. Back when I believed in showing up for myself. I pinned my hair up. I skipped perfume. I left early and parked 2 blocks from the Harrington estate. I walked slowly, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to feel every step. I wasn't rushing toward confrontation. I was walking toward truth, steady and unshaken. They wouldn't see it coming. The Harrington estate looked exactly as it always had, perfect, curated, untouched by real life. A white wreath hung on the tall black door, flanked by 2 symmetrical arrangements of autumn leaves, neither of which had a single browning edge. I rang the bell exactly at the time stated on the invitation. A housekeeper I didn't recognize opened the door and took my coat with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Miles wasn't at the entrance. Iris was. She stood at the base of the stairs in a structured burgundy dress, one hand on the banister like a queen surveying a guest. "Joey," she said, voice smooth, "you made it. We weren't sure if work would keep you." The dig was wrapped in courtesy. As always, I just smiled. I wouldn't miss it. She led me into the living room, where familiar faces floated between glasses of wine and platters of charcuterie. The entire extended Harrington family was there, Miles's brothers, their wives, various cousins, retired board members, and even Dr. Sinclair, who was technically no longer practicing, but still attended these things like he had tenure in their lives. I scanned the room quickly. Miles was near the fireplace, laughing with 2 men from the hospital, and to his right stood Harper. She was wearing a tasteful cream dress, simple but clearly expensive, with her hair in a soft chignon and a single strand of pearls around her neck. She looked composed, like she belonged, like she knew she belonged. Iris guided me through the room with the gentle pressure of a hand on my back, introducing me with almost maternal warmth. "You remember Joey?" "Of course," she'd say, or Miles's wife, the pediatrician. It was so practiced it made my skin prickle. When we reached Harper, the air changed slightly. "This is Harper Whitman," Iris said casually. "She's been shadowing Miles on the surgical side. Such a quick learner." Harper smiled and extended her hand. "It's so nice to finally meet you. Miles talks about you all the time." Her voice was kind, too kind. Either she knew everything or she knew nothing. I wasn't sure which was worse. We moved to the dining room shortly after, where Iris had already assigned seats. The table was long and immaculate, set with silver-rimmed china and crystal glasses. Iris took the head, her husband opposite. Miles sat to her right, Harper beside him. I was 4 seats down on the left, between a distant cousin and an uncle I barely knew. The message was clear. This wasn't just a dinner. This was choreography, a quiet removal, a declaration of placement. The meal began in the usual Harrington-style formal. Rehearsed. Elegant. First course. Second. Then the turkey carved at the table by Miles's father, while Iris narrated the family recipe's legacy. No one spoke above a murmur. No one interrupted. When the final course was served pecan tart and pumpkin pie, Iris stood, glass in hand. The room quieted instantly. Her timing, as always, was deliberate. "I'd like to offer a toast," she said, smiling faintly, "to tradition, to family, and to those who understand the value of both." She glanced directly at me as she said it. A pause, long enough to sting. "And of course, to the women who lift our sons up rather than weigh them down." A murmur moved through the room like a draft. Miles shifted slightly but said nothing. No one did. The silence was not new, it was practiced. I reached down and slipped the envelope from my bag, setting it lightly beside my plate. Then I stood. "Since we're sharing," I said, my voice steady, "I'd like to contribute something as well." Chairs shifted, forks paused. I picked up the envelope and held it lightly in both hands. "Most of you don't know that before Miles and I were married, Iris requested I sign a prenuptial agreement. She selected the attorney, drafted the terms, and required that I waive any rights to family assets. I agreed without hesitation. I was marrying for love." I could see Iris's jaw tightening, but I didn't stop. "But what's more interesting is what's in the rest of this envelope." I unfolded the printed memo. This is a copy of an internal initiative designed by Iris herself, a mentorship program pairing promising female residents with senior surgeons, the first placement Harper Whitman, under Miles's supervision. The room went still. Even Harper looked stunned. "And this," I said, pulling out the last sheet, "is an email, dated 6 months ago, subject line, 'Not yet,' from Iris to Miles, regarding the prenup, and what happens when a marriage is no longer a fit." Miles stood up then. "Joey, we don't have to do this here." I looked at him, then slowly around the room. "That's the thing. We do. Because I've spent 6 years being silent in the right rooms. And all it did was make space for someone else to tell my story for me." The table was silent. Iris opened her mouth but found nothing to say. And in that silence, I felt something return. Not power, not revenge, just presence. My own voice, finally louder than the one that tried to replace it. I placed the final sheet of paper down and returned to my seat without fanfare, without flourish. The weight of it wasn't in the volume, but in the silence that followed. No one moved. Even the usual clinking of glasses or the awkward coughs people used to fill space were absent. Harper looked pale. She hadn't expected to be part of a public dismantling, and to be honest, I didn't blame her. She was young, ambitious, likely unaware of how methodical Iris could be in her machinations. Iris, however, was not speechless, just temporarily stunned. Her instinct wasn't retreat, it was recalibration. "You've completely misunderstood," she said, voice clipped and controlled. "The mentorship program is about elevating talented women, not undermining anyone." She glanced quickly around the table, as if searching for nods of agreement. She didn't find any. Most of the guests were still processing what they'd just seen. Miles's father was staring at his plate. One of his brothers cleared his throat, quietly excused himself from the table, and left the room. I didn't respond to Iris. I didn't need to. The papers spoke for themselves, and so did the years that led to this moment. Miles finally sat down again, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost embarrassed. "I didn't authorize any of that. The email, I didn't answer it." I looked at him across the table, not with anger, but with something closer to fatigue. "You didn't stop it either," I said, keeping my voice calm. You let it continue. And silence is also a decision. He opened his mouth to say something else, but I stood again before he could. I'm not here to shame anyone, I said, now addressing the room, and I'm not here to reclaim a place I was never truly given. I've stayed quiet for years, out of politeness, out of loyalty, and out of hope that if I worked hard enough, was kind enough, professional enough, I'd eventually be accepted. But what I've learned is that some rooms are designed to keep certain people standing near the door, no matter how hard they try to take a seat. I picked up my bag and slid the envelope back inside. I'm not asking for anything. Not the house, not the name, not the narrative. I'm leaving with what I came into this marriage with, my own integrity. I turned toward Harper, who had tears welling in her eyes, whether from guilt or shock. I wasn't sure. I don't think you knew what you were part of, I told her softly. But I hope now you do. And then I looked back at Iris. It must be exhausting, always building stories where you are the center. I hope one day you realize that legacy isn't something you protect with contracts and control. It's something earned by how you treat people when you think no one's watching. No one followed me out. I didn't rush. I thanked the staff on the way, even the new housekeeper who avoided my eyes. The air outside was sharper than when I arrived, and it felt good. I walked to my car, slipped off my heels, and drove to the apartment I'd signed for quietly the week before. It was empty, save for the 2 bags I'd left there that morning, and a folded blanket on the floor where I planned to sleep for one night before my new furniture arrived. I turned off my phone. I didn't want apologies or explanations. I wanted quiet, not the cold, cutting quiet of the Harrington home, but the kind that allows space for rebuilding. The next morning, I filed for divorce. I gave Lauren instructions to move forward without requesting any shared assets. She protested at first, reminded me of the financial implications. But I stood firm. I didn't want anything that came from their world. I didn't want to argue over property whose walls had witnessed my erasure. I didn't even want the jewelry, most of which had come in boxes stamped with Iris's name. What I did keep was one small thing, a photo of me in scrubs, taken after my first solo procedure at the hospital, a patient chart in one hand, a coffee cup in the other. I'd looked exhausted and alive. That woman hadn't needed anyone's approval to feel valuable. I wanted to find her again, and in the quiet of that bare apartment, I felt her coming back. Over the next few days, Miles texted multiple times. At first, just apologies, then explanations, then questions. I didn't reply, not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to discuss. He had stood beside silence for too long, and by the time he realized he needed to speak, I had already finished listening. The divorce was finalized 3 months later, as cleanly and quietly as I had asked. No public statement, no courtroom battles, no last-minute settlements. I signed the papers at Lauren's office on a Tuesday morning, the sun spilling through her window like an afterthought. Miles wasn't there. He'd signed ahead of time, probably to avoid the weight of my presence. I didn't cry. I didn't linger. I just handed the pen back, pressed my thumb against the page to flatten the corner, and said thank you. Lauren watched me for a moment, then asked softly, "Are you sure you don't want anything?" I shook my head. I've already taken everything that matters. In the months that followed, I built a rhythm I hadn't known I was missing. I woke up early, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. I drank coffee on the small balcony of my new apartment, overlooking the river that cut through the city like a line of quiet defiance. I returned to work slowly, at my own pace. choosing the patients I wanted to follow, the research I wanted to contribute to. No one second-guessed my schedule. No one asked if I'd consulted with anyone else before making decisions. My name went on the door without needing to be justified. I reconnected with colleagues I'd once distanced myself from. Dr. Kim invited me to co-author a pediatric trauma case study, and I accepted without hesitation. We presented it together at a conference, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like my voice was not only heard, but trusted. Afterward, at the hotel bar, he raised his glass to me and said, "Welcome back." I didn't realize how much I needed to hear those words until that exact moment. Outside of work, I allowed myself stillness. I picked up old hobbies, sketching, running, cooking things without measuring. I called my mother more often. We spoke about everything and nothing. She never said "I told you so," never asked for details. She just listened, the way only someone who's already seen you survive once can. One evening, she sent me a photo of my childhood bedroom, now turned into her reading nook, with a caption that read, "It's okay to rewrite your spaces." I printed it and taped it above my desk. Then came the letter, handwritten, no return address. The handwriting was unmistakable. Iris. I stared at it for a full hour before opening it. Inside was a single line, "If you're willing." I'd like a chance to speak privately. No apology, no explanation, just the cold efficiency of someone used to holding power by invitation. I placed the letter in a drawer and didn't respond. I didn't need closure. I'd already closed the door. But still, I brought it up in therapy, half wondering if I should grant the conversation. My therapist asked one question: would you be doing it for her or for you? That was enough. I never sent a reply. Miles reached out again a few weeks later. His message was longer this time, thoughtful, measured, full of language that sounded like it came from someone finally doing the work. He said he missed my clarity, my presence, my steadiness, that he'd begun to understand the depth of what he'd allowed, how his inaction had spoken louder than he intended. He didn't ask to get back together. He didn't beg. He simply said he hoped I was well, and that if I ever wanted to talk, he'd be there. I didn't answer, but I didn't delete it either. Sometimes silence is not punishment, it's peace. By spring, I applied for a faculty position at a new children's clinic opening across the city. The role wasn't just clinical, it included leadership in ethics policy and advocacy. The very areas I'd once been told were soft focus in a world of prestige metrics. I was accepted without an interview. My references spoke for themselves. I signed the contract with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. Then, one morning in early May, I sat across from a fertility specialist in a quiet office and said, "I'd like to explore options for motherhood on my terms." The doctor didn't blink. She nodded, handed me a folder, and said, "We'll start where you are." It wasn't a dramatic reinvention. It was a slow return to self, to voice, to space. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I wasn't climbing back to recover what I'd lost. I was building something I had never been allowed to name in that marriage sovereignty. The right to belong without needing permission. The right to speak without waiting to be introduced. I didn't regret the marriage, not because it brought me joy, but because it taught me to stop mistaking decorum for love. There's a kind of betrayal that doesn't scream, it erodes, and the hardest part isn't escaping it. It's recognizing that you've already survived it. A year passed before I stepped back into the Harrington circle. though I never truly intended to. It happened on a quiet Thursday morning in June, when I received an invitation to speak at a regional pediatric ethics conference. I scanned the keynote list absent-mindedly, then froze when I saw the name 2 lines below mine. William Harrington, Miles's father, listed as a panelist on medical philanthropy and institutional legacy. I considered withdrawing, but something in me resisted. I wasn't running anymore. I had no reason to hide. I was no longer the woman who had to measure her steps so she wouldn't be accused of walking too loudly. The conference was held at a glass and steel convention center just outside the city. I arrived early, found my room, and went over my notes. I wasn't nervous, if anything. I felt sharp, calm, even curious. When I walked into the networking breakfast the next day, I saw William before he saw me. His hair had more gray in it now. His shoulders hunched slightly, like a man carrying the weight of silence too long. When he finally looked up and caught my eye, he didn't look surprised. He looked resolved. He crossed the room and stopped a respectful distance away. "Joey," he said quietly, "I wasn't sure you'd be here." I nodded once. Neither was I. He asked if we could speak privately after the panel. I agreed, not out of obligation, but because I was no longer afraid of anything he could say. After the session, we found an empty cafe tucked near the building's west wing. He bought 2 coffees and sat across from me with both hands folded on the table. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he began. "I owe you an apology, not for what Iris did. That's hers to own. But for what I didn't do. I let it happen. I let it go on far longer than it should have. I thought I was keeping the peace, but I see now. I was just keeping power where it always sat, and that came at your expense." I didn't reply right away. I just sipped my coffee and let the weight of his words settle. When I finally spoke, I said, "What you let happen said more than what you ever said aloud. But I appreciate the honesty now." He nodded solemnly. "She's changed," he added. "Or she's trying to. Therapy, family ultimatums. She doesn't see the grandkids unless she goes twice a week." I raised an eyebrow, and Miles William gave a slow shake of his head. He moved into a condo in Cambridge, working too much, still quiet, but he doesn't mention you without regret. I didn't feel satisfied by that, just sad. Not for me, but for who Miles could have been if he had chosen differently, if he had stood earlier, if he had broken the chain instead of inheriting it. William placed a card on the table, one I didn't pick up. "If you ever want to meet," he said, "just as people, not as family." I gave him a small nod. "I'm not sure that's something I need, but thank you." And we left it at that. 2 months later, I sat in the small nursery of my new apartment, watching the rain streak softly across the window. The room was quiet, except for the soft rustle of the mobile above the crib. Sophia, my daughter, was sleeping. She was 6 weeks old, born on a Tuesday morning after 10 hours of labor and 3 years of quiet longing, conceived through IVF, delivered by a team I trusted, held first by me and no one else. No family standing over my shoulder, no expectations hung over her cradle, just breath, just warmth, just mine. I thought about all the rooms I had stood in over the years, waiting for someone to open a door wide enough for me to step through. And now, sitting there in my own space, in my own rhythm, with a child who would never be asked to earn her place in a room she was born into. I felt a peace I had never known. Not loud, not euphoric, but solid. Something to stand on. One night, while feeding Sophia, I checked an email from a colleague inviting me to join a working group on women in medicine and institutional bias. I accepted with one sentence, happy to lend my voice. And that's what it was now. A voice no longer trying to win over the room. A voice that existed for its own sake and for hers. I never saw Iris again. I never replied to the second letter she sent. This one longer, more reflective, even admitting to what she called generational blindness. I didn't need her to name it. I had already left it behind. But part of me was strangely grateful. Not for her treatment, not for the pain, but for the clarity it forced. You learn a lot when someone shows you what their love really costs. And you learn even more when you choose not to pay it. Sophia was almost a year old when I received the invitation. It arrived not by email, but as a thick cream-colored envelope, hand-addressed in delicate calligraphy. The return address was the Harrington estate. I knew before opening it that it would be from Iris. Inside was a folded card embossed with gold edges, inviting me and Sophia to attend Miles's wedding. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The envelope open in front of me. Sophia babbling softly on the playmat nearby. The irony wasn't lost on me. A year ago, I had walked out of that house with nothing but my truth, and now I was being asked to return as a quiet spectator to the replacement ceremony. There was no bitterness, just a stillness, the kind you feel when a story finally lands where it was always headed. I didn't attend. I didn't send a gift. I didn't even respond. Some closures don't need to be verbalized. They just need to be honored by not reopening the door. A week later, I received a second envelope, this one containing a photo from the wedding. A glossy image of Miles and his new wife beneath the rose arch in the Harrington garden. The handwriting on the back said, "In case Sophia ever wants to know the family she came from." I placed it in a drawer I rarely open, not out of anger, but because I understood now that her family would be defined by what I built around her, not by the people who stood behind her father at a polished altar. Work was steady, focused, and deeply fulfilling. My new clinic had begun partnering with schools in underserved communities, offering mobile pediatric care and early intervention counseling. I spent mornings reviewing cases, afternoons mentoring younger physicians, and evenings folding laundry with Sophia tucked against my hip. It was simple. It was unglamorous. It was mine. Every so often, I'd run into someone from the old life, a doctor I used to share a committee with, a cousin of Miles's at a public health fundraiser. Their greetings were always a little hesitant, like they weren't sure whether to acknowledge what had happened or pretend it hadn't. I always smiled. I never flinched. If they brought up the past, I answered kindly but briefly, if they didn't. I let the conversation drift naturally. I had nothing to prove. There is a certain power in not needing to explain your absence. Iris never reached out again. William sent a short card after Sophia's first birthday, unsigned, with a pressed daffodil inside. I kept it, folded between the pages of a medical ethics textbook, not for sentiment, but for evidence, that even silence, when wrapped in gentleness, can be a form of apology. One afternoon, during a panel discussion at the clinic, a young intern asked me how I had balanced motherhood and ambition. I paused longer than expected before answering. Then I told her the truth, that the hardest part hadn't been the work. It had been unlearning the belief that I had to earn my place in every room I entered, that sometimes the strongest act of ambition isn't rising louder, but refusing to shrink. She nodded slowly, and I saw in her eyes something I hadn't seen in mine until recently: permission. Sophia began walking not long after that. Her steps were wobbly at first, hesitant and wide-legged, but her determination was pure. I watched her stumble, then push herself up with tiny hands and try again without looking back. And I realized that's what healing had taught me, not how to stay upright all the time, but how to get up without waiting for applause. There was no grand finale, no dramatic confrontation, no public vindication, just life, unfolding exactly as it should. Quiet mornings, honest work, a child who smiled with her whole face and never had to ask if she belonged. One night, after putting Sophia to bed, I sat down at my desk and began writing again. Not medical notes or case reports, but essays, reflections on identity, legacy, and quiet power. I submitted a piece to a national journal on women in leadership. It was published 3 weeks later, without edits. The title was simple: "You don't need the room's permission to stand." And that was the truth I had earned, not through revenge, not through drama, but through staying when I needed to stay, leaving when I knew I had to leave, and rebuilding slowly, clearly, and without shame. On the second Thanksgiving, after everything unraveled, I woke up to the scent of cinnamon and apples in my kitchen, not someone else's. The pie was mine, the recipe handwritten by my mother when I was 12, tucked into a notebook now stained with butter and memory. Sophia was sitting on the floor beside me, chewing on a wooden spoon, watching me with the kind of trust only children give freely. The sun came in strong through the east-facing window, casting warm light across our little table already set for two. There was no orchestra of polished cutlery, no receiving line at the door, no seating chart or floral monogram pressed onto linen, and still, it felt full. Later that morning, I stepped onto the balcony with my coffee and watched the city move quietly around me. A neighbor waved from the sidewalk below, their arms full of groceries and laughter. Somewhere nearby, someone was playing old jazz through a cracked window. I thought briefly of the years I spent trying to find belonging in rooms that were never meant to fit me. I thought of the silence I once wore like armor, the way I measured my voice to sound palatable, the way I waited for someone else to decide whether I mattered. That version of me wouldn't have recognized this morning, but the woman standing there now did, fully, without apology. I hadn't heard from Miles in months. The last message was short. He told me he had started therapy again and that he had begun writing for himself, finally trying to understand what it meant to be quiet in all the wrong moments. He didn't ask for another chance. He didn't blame me. That alone was progress. I didn't write back, but I hoped he kept going. Sometimes healing means never returning to the place you were hurt. Sometimes it just means finally knowing why you stayed as long as you did. Sophia took her first unassisted steps that afternoon, walking from the edge of the couch to the kitchen table while holding a piece of apple in one fist. She didn't ask for help. She just did it, wobbly, certain, determined. And when she reached the chair, she turned, grinned wide, and collapsed into my lap like she'd always known where she was meant to land. I held her for a long time and whispered the words I never got tired of repeating: "You belong, no matter who's watching." That night, after she fell asleep, I opened my laptop and began drafting a new essay. This one wasn't about legacy or survival or even ethics. It was about choosing a life where your existence isn't someone else's project, where your name isn't a footnote to someone else's introduction, where peace isn't earned through silence, but built through clarity. I ended the piece with a line that had been sitting in my mind for weeks. The most dangerous cage is the one built with polite smiles and conditional love. Then I closed the document and walked to the window, letting the city lights fold around me like a soft coat. I never thought standing up for myself would feel so still. I expected a fire, a headline, a moment that snapped the world into attention. But what came instead was subtle. It was walking away from a room before they noticed you'd stopped clapping. It was letting go without waiting for the apology. It was realizing that the life you were fighting for didn't need an audience, just air, sunlight, and a bit of honest space. Some days, I still remember that night at the Harrington table, the way the room went quiet, the way Iris froze. Not because of guilt, but because she'd lost control of the narrative. I don't revisit that memory with anger. I revisit it to remind myself of something deeper, that the truth doesn't need to shout to change everything. It just needs to be spoken once, in the right moment, by someone who has finally stopped asking for permission. We ended that day the way we'd begun it, quietly. I washed dishes while Sophia babbled to herself in a chorus of invented words. No drama, no speech, just the gentle sound of water, ceramic, and a new rhythm. The past didn't knock. The future didn't demand. There was just now, and in that now, I was no longer waiting to be invited in. I had already built the door. If you've ever had to sit in a room where you were tolerated instead of loved, if you've ever swallowed your voice to keep the peace, if you've ever questioned your own worth because someone handed you a contract dressed as tradition, know this. You don't need their seat. You can build your own table. And when you do, it won't be perfect, but it will be yours. Have you ever had to leave a place that once felt like home, just to finally become yourself? I'd love to hear your story, because sometimes the loudest freedom lives in the quietest decisions.